So I really want to thank the World Federation of Hemophilia for giving me the opportunity to give this plenary lecture. And I am very proud to be giving it this year here in Glasgow. I'm actually from the other side of Scotland, from Dundee, but many of my family and my ancestors are from Glasgow. So we know that historically much of the focus of the Congress has been on males with haemophilia, but really more recently there's been a lot more attention directed towards issues faced by girls and women with bleeding disorders. And I'm proud to have the opportunity to talk more about their issues with you today. So my disclosures are none except I am a woman, I don't have a bleeding disorder, but I have menstruated. So haemophilia has been known about for some time now, clearly not to the same extent as we know about it now. But at the end of the 19th century, The Lancet published an article about a case of haemophilia with a family pedigree identified across 5 generations. And what was very interesting about the article is that it was about a girl called Florence who presented with profuse bleeding after a dental extraction. Now, she was the child of first cousins, from a bleeder family, George from the bleeder family, and her mother, Eliza, was not a bleeder, but possibly came from a bleeder family. And despite their article being about the bleeding that this young girl had, they stated in the article, it may almost be said that the females hand down the disease while the males are the victims of it. Now, we know a lot more about haemophilia and genetics to know that this is not the case, but you're not surprised, as I am not, that there are many people out there, including doctors and nurses and other clinical staff, who believe this and somehow believe that males are the passive victims of haemophilia. So, only males get haemophilia and females are carriers. To help dispel any lingering myths, I just wanted to do a basic genetic lesson. So humans have 46 chromosomes that carry all the genes that tell us our hair colour, our eye colour, and females and males have 22 pairs, and genetic females have a 23rd pair of X chromosomes, and males have an X and Y chromosome. We each inherit a set of genes from our mother and from our father, and as most of you know here, that the haemophilia gene haemophilia is an X-linked disease, with factor 8 and factor 9 genes being on the X chromosome. So basically, if there's a problem with the factor 8 or factor 9 gene in a male, he will have haemophilia because he's only got one X chromosome, whereas if a female has the haemophilia gene, she generally will make some clotting factor on the other X chromosome, so her bleeding is not usually as severe as her clotting factor is not usually so low. Now, eggs and sperm have a single set of chromosomes, so about half of the eggs in a woman with the haemophilia gene, seen in red, will have the mutation and the other half in blue won't. Each month, generally one egg is released. If her partner is a man who doesn't have haemophilia, half of his sperm will have a normal X chromosome and the other half will have a normal Y chromosome. So let's imagine on the month that the haemophilia egg is released, the Y chromosome sperm wins the race, and that would mean that month that couple would be having a baby boy affected by haemophilia. But there is another possible scenario. There's a scenario where a woman's got 2 normal factor 8 or factor 9 genes, and her partner is a male with haemophilia. So her X chromosomes will all be normal for the factor 8 or 9 gene, and if the male's affected X chromosome wins the race, the couple will have a daughter who has the haemophilia gene. So effectively, as you all know, all daughters to a man with haemophilia will have the haemophilia gene, and none of a man's sons will be affected because a man gives his sons the Y chromosome. So clearly, both males and females carry the haemophilia gene from one generation to the next. Now, I know that a lot of parents with genetic diseases describe feeling a lot of guilt passing on abnormal genes, but mothers do seem to take on a greater share of the blame, and mothers, speaking personally, especially seem to excel at guilt. The recent WFH survey told us that there are a lot of people in the world with haemophilia, and we know that most of them are males. Kaiser and Lynn estimated that for every male in a family with haemophilia, there might be up to 5 females in each family who need to be tested. Now, this might seem like quite a lot, but if we just carefully look at one fictitious family, we can demonstrate that actually this is the case. So let's imagine, just for argument's sake, that Bart Simpson has severe haemophilia. Hemophilia B, let's say. So we know that this gene must have come from his mum Marg, not Homer. So that means that there's a 50-50 chance that either Lisa or Maggie will also have the hemophilia gene. There's a 50-50 chance that Selma and Patty will also have the hemophilia gene. Now, the gene could either have come from Clancy Bouvier, who's Marg's dad. Now, he was one of the earliest male flight attendants, and he also worked in the US Navy, believe it or not. Or it could have come from her mum, Jacqueline. We don't know. But we do know that Jacqueline had a sister called Gladys. They also had a brother called Lou. Lou is dead. We don't know how he died. He could have died from bleeding. So to come back to Selma and Patty, Selma has been married 7 times altogether, most notably here to Sideshow Bob, actually Homer's dad, Abe, Troy McClure, and Fat Tony. She tried very hard to have children, but she couldn't have any herself, but she did adopt baby Ling, so it's very unlikely that baby Ling has hemophilia. So that's a lot of women in this one putative family to test. And knowing this family, their dog, Santa's Little Helper, is probably almost also going to have hemophilia as well, knowing their luck. So you know as well, so we know that we know that both males and females carry the gene. But what about looking at only men get hemophilia? You all know about the different factor levels in people with hemophilia. Normal levels are 50 to 150%, mild, moderate, and severe outlined here. But let's imagine, go back to The Simpsons, Marg's got 2 X chromosomes. So one's got a normal factor 9 gene and the other one makes less than 1% factor 9. If the X chromosomes are equally active, then the factor 9 production will be about 50%. But this isn't always the case. There's a process that some of you might have heard about called lionization, named after a Professor Lion. Now, this results in a relative inactivation of a set of genes in any pair of chromosomes. And I think calico cats will give a really good example of how this works. So calico cats, or tortoiseshell cats, are usually female because they've got 2 X chromosomes. The X chromosomes code for the orange hair gene and the black hair gene. So this cat here has got equal expression of the orange hair gene and the black hair gene, so it's 50-50 orange and black. But there are some cases where the orange hair gene gets inactivated, and this little kitten here has inactivated much of her orange gene chromosome, so she's mostly black. But the opposite can happen, and this pussycat here has got more black inactivation than orange inactivation, so she's more ginger. So exactly the same thing can happen with the factor 8 or the factor 9 gene. So that in some women, their normal factor 8 or factor 9 gene is inactivated to such an extent that some women actually have clotting factor levels that are very similar to the affected males in the family. So we also know that women with the hemophilia gene are more likely, within the families, those women who've got the hemophilia gene are more likely to have bleeding symptoms than women who don't have the hemophilia gene within the family. And we know that if you have a hemophilia gene within a family study, that the women with the gene are more likely to bleed after operations, they're more likely to bleed after dental extraction or tonsillectomy or adenoidectomy. So, both males and females carry the hemophilia gene from one generation to the next, and females with hemophilia bleed too. And I was really pleased to see that the World Federation of Hemophilia has changed its definition for hemophilia. So now people, males or females with hemophilia, are diagnosed according to the clotting factor level. And we don't use the phrase symptomatic or asymptomatic carriers anymore to describe all women with the gene, depending on whether or not they bleed. The phrase symptomatic carrier is now used to describe women who've got factor levels of 40 to 60%, but who also have bleeding symptoms. And that makes a lot more sense to me. So we know that clearly hemophilia in A and B are more common in males, but there are a lot of other bleeding disorders that you're all aware of that are more common in females in the red than they are in males. And actually the WFH has shown that there's an increasing rate of diagnosis of von Willebrand's disease in women than there is in men. Now, that's possibly because women are more likely to be faced with hemostatic challenges in life. And those challenges are mainly menstruation and childbirth, unique challenges to women that men don't face. Now, of all the problems that women with bleeding disorders have, I would say, apart from childbirth, one of the most troublesome is heavy menstrual bleeding. In fact, as many as 9 out of 10 women with bleeding disorders have heavy menstrual bleeding. And globally, it's thought that up to 18 million women in the world have abnormal uterine bleeding and heavy menstrual bleeding, and studies suggest that 10 to 20% of those women, 1 to 2 million, will have the problem. And what's really important is that women with bleeding disorders tend to bleed longer and tend to bleed more heavily throughout their period than women who've got the same, who have heavy menstrual bleeding, who don't have a bleeding disorder. Now, you'll probably be pleased to hear, if you don't do gynecology, that there's been a move away from using words like menorrhagia, dysfunctional uterine bleeding, etc., to describe abnormal uterine bleeding. And now the International Federation of Gynae and Oncology uses the phrase abnormal uterine bleeding, and it defines how much blood is lost, how long the bleeding is going on for, and how long the periods how frequently the periods are, the pattern of bleeding, and they describe whether or not it's acute or chronic. So it is a little bit easier, the terminology. Now, if you really want to find out about bleeding and find out if a woman's periods are problematic, you really need to ask some directed questions, not just, do you have any problem with your periods? And hurriedly move on to the next question. You need to ask what sort of protection they use. Do they use superabsorbent or maternity pads? Do they have to use both tampons and pads at the same time? You have to ask how often women need to change their menstrual protection. And if it's less than every hour, that's really important. You have to ask them how many pads and or tampons they use each cycle. Do they have problems where they worry about leakage onto their clothes, onto bedclothes, onto furniture? How much school or work they've missed as a result of their periods, and whether or not they've ever had anemia, that means they've had to either have a blood transfusion or take iron supplements. And now the definition for heavy menstrual bleeding, rather than a measurement, is actually excessive menstrual blood loss that interferes with a woman's physical, social, emotional, and or material quality of life. There's no need for us really to be doing PBAC scores anymore. Now, one great thing for women with bleeding disorders or a woman with abnormal uterine bleeding is that there are many different treatment options available depending really on the severity of the bleeding, whether a woman wants to have contraception as well, or whether or not she's at a stage in her life when she doesn't wish to preserve her fertility and she's looking for a long-term solution with either hysterectomy or endometrial ablation. But it's clear that these treatment decisions are complex, and it's difficult sometimes for women to know what the best option is for them. So it's very important that women have an opportunity to speak to specialists about what her options are. And I would say that one of the major impediments to accessing healthcare for all women with heavy menstrual bleeding is recognising that they've got a problem. Their bleeding, if they talk about it with friends and family, might be just as bad as their mother or their sisters. It's what they've come to expect and what they expect they have to deal with. However, even for women who actually think that they have a problem with bleeding, perhaps only 4 out of 5 of those women will go and approach a medical practitioner for help. So that means there's an awful lot of women out there with heavy menstrual bleeding, and especially with bleeding disorders, who feel unable to ask for help. And why might that be that we won't ask for help? Many women are uncomfortable to talk, in particular, I'm sorry to the men in the audience, to male clinicians about their periods, because they're ashamed or embarrassed. Talking about periods is a taboo subject. Why should this be? It's a biological event. It occurs at generally regular intervals over a few decades in the lives of over half the world's population. It's a very commonplace event, and yet it's got a significant negative symbolic status across many different cultures in the world, with remarkably similar ideas that menstruating women and menstrual blood are taboo and polluting. And an overarching theme, when you look at 18th and 20th century mainstream anthropological studies, is that there's a need to constrain menstruating women because of a perceived or reported toxicity of menstrual blood and menstruating women. In fact, many of the world's religions prescribe very specific behaviours for menstruating women. In Jewish law, for example, no physical contact is allowed between males and women during menstruation and for 1 week after. This includes passing objects between one another, sharing a bed, sitting on the same cushion of a couch, eating directly from the wife's leftovers, smelling her perfume, gazing on her clothing, whether or not she's wearing it, listening to her sing. And a clean period follows after the unclean period, or the niddah, the week of bleeding, or the times of bleeding, and the week after. And to cleanse, women must have a ritual bath, or the mikveh. And in fact, in a chapter called Unclean Discharges, Sexual Behaviours and Grave Crimes in the book of Leviticus, it's stated that if someone touches a menstruating woman during niddah, they will be ritually unclean until evening. But impurity of menstruating women is also a facet of many other religions. Hindu women, for example, should not cook when they're menstruating. They need to use separate utensils. They can't touch flowers. They can't touch other men or women. They shouldn't touch pickles, or the pickle might rot away. They shouldn't ride an elephant or drive a car. They can't touch the sacred basil plant, or it might die. And in fact, some people believe that even the shadow of a menstruating woman falling on a basil plant will cause it to wither and die. Buddhism considers menstruating women to be a dangerous vulnerability, and menstrual blood is thought to be a poison that might attract ghosts. Menstruating women should not be allowed into an area where rice is fermenting, or the rice will spoil. Russian Orthodox Christians instruct that menstruating women should not touch raw fish or fresh food, and they even believe that a menstruating woman's gaze is thought to adversely affect the weather. Where I was brought up in Scotland, we called our periods the curse. The curse because we believe, probably because it came from the curse of Eve. Eve was the one who ate the apple and was tempted. The majority of religions in the world prohibit menstruating women from entering temples, shrines, mosques, or from even touching holy books, saying prayers, or meditating. The majority of religions also prohibit sexual intercourse while women are menstruating, and some for up to a week after. If a man lie with a menstruating woman and reveal her nakedness, and she revealed the fountain of her blood, both of them will be cut off from their people. Now, while I know that strict enforcement of these rules is probably not what many religious people do, I think there's a pervasive message there that all religions have, that there is something bad, something polluting, something problematic about menstrual blood and menstruating women. And isolation and seclusion for menstruating women, as I've said, is instructed by many religions. Some cultures even have menstrual huts on the edge of the village where women are supposed to live while they're menstruating. But not in all cultures are the women confined to live there. Now, some authors have suggested that the rules governing menstruating women in primitive cultures, where they're not allowed to hunt or eat game, and they were also secluded, might have been introduced because these primitive people lacked understanding about the biological basis of menstruation. They were threatened by recurrent bleeding that happened every 28 days without any apparent wound. It was a process that perhaps mirrored that of the moon, so menstruation could appear supernatural. And perhaps these primitive people could have been confused that menstruation occurred only in females, disappeared during pregnancy, and when the woman got older. But to be honest, the more I learn about these primitive cultures, I understand that they knew an awful lot more about menstruation than we give them credit for. I mean, contemporary psychoanalytic therapy has discussed that the menstrual taboos exist because of vagina envy. Men are envious of women's ability to bear children. So there's a dominant narrative, I think, I've highlighted, that menstrual taboos have been developed by men with the aim of subjugating women, maintaining them in a subservient and inferior position in society. And indeed, in many societies, these taboos do perpetuate the dominance of men over women. However, contemporary anthropologists and ethnologists are challenging the idea that the societal rules around menstruation were developed just by men, with no input from women. And they're challenging the dominant narrative that menstruation and menstruating women are polluting and must be kept apart from men to protect the men. They've used different processes to do this technique. They actually talk to women about menstruation, and they're discovering that the seclusion and isolation of women and the decisions that women are decisions that women played a part in, not to protect men from the evil powers of menstruation, but as a recognition of the importance and the power of menstruation and menstruating women. And I'd like to share some of these ideas. So I'll start my journey in New Zealand, which is about here. Actually, I've lived there for 28 years, and it's not on this map, but that's a pretty common feature in the world. New Zealand gets missed out on a lot of world maps. You can just Google it, and then you'll find. Just found missing New Zealand on a world map. So you have a better idea about where we are in the world, right at the top of the world here, next to Australia. So it was the Dutchman Abel Tasman who was the first European who was recorded to have landed in New Zealand in 1642. And over 100 years later, James Cook made the first of 3 voyages in the Pacific, landing in Poverty Bay in New Zealand. And over the next 100 or more years, immigration to New Zealand from Britain continued apace. You can see here that you got a free gift. If you were over 18, you got a free gift of free land, 40 acres of land for just 10 shillings. And if you were between 5 to 15, you could get 20 acres of land for just 5 shillings. You did have to pay your passage, so you didn't get relocation expenses. And you can see this is from Port Glasgow, the first colony, Scottish colony from New Zealand, which I'm sure is in Dunedin. This is in 1839. You can see that you could have left on this ship to go to New Zealand. It must have taken quite a few weeks in those days. And, you know, this free land that was all available in this undiscovered country, you can imagine that the promised free land was a little bit upsetting to the Maori people who'd lived in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for over 1,000 years. And so after colonisation of New Zealand, anthropological studies that examined the pre-colonial Maori customs almost uniformly would have been carried out by the invading men who spoke to the Maori men about subjects they considered to be important. And I would imagine that approaches to menstruation were not high on the agenda. And women in pre-colonial Maori society actually played a very important role, but the role of women was seen through the lens of Victorian colonisers, who weren't really known to be strongly supportive of feminism. And you see in this Victorian sketch of a meeting between British colonisers and Maori, there are no Maori women. That's not how it was. And this exclusion and marginalisation of the woman's knowledge and roles and status continued for many decades in New Zealand. There was a very early male-centric anthropological research that allowed a perpetuation of a negative view of menstruation in Maori society, one that really reflected more the mores of a Victorian society and not necessarily the attitudes or customs of pre-colonial, pre-contact Maori society. More recently, this negative approach to menstruation and menstruating women has been challenged by research carried out by Nahuia Murphy in her book Te Awa Atua. She used the autoethnographic approach, the talking to people approach. She got women to tell their stories. She got Maori elders to tell their stories. And she did that in an attempt to reclaim the knowledge of the ceremonies associated with menstruation that Maori women had in pre-colonial Maori times. And she did it this way to concentrate on a Maori worldview. Now, critical to the understanding of her research, let's look again at the meaning of the word taboo and its origins. It comes from a Polynesian word, ta, to mark, pu, thoroughly. It means something that is marked thoroughly, something that is set apart from the ordinary, something that is sacred. It's forbidden only in the sense that it's special and important. It's different to the normal, the profane, noa, as it's known in Maori and Polynesian. Now, menstruation is taboo in Maori society, but you can immediately see that if we use this meaning of tapu or taboo, something sacred starts to emerge. And let me tell you a bit more Maori. In Maori, te whare means the house. Tangata means people. The words te whare tangata, that means the home of the people or the house of humanity, are the Maori words for womb. Te awa is the river. Atua is sacred. Te awa atua is the Maori phrase for menstruation, the sacred river. Again, this brings a whole new positive light to menstruation That's something to be celebrated, perhaps ritualized. And in fact, in Maori society, in pre-colonial Maori society, Te Awa Atua was identified as the time to rest. And the restrictions imposed, the toi whakatapu, they were imposed by women. Women were instructed not to go to gather food in gardens or at the beach or cook, because menstruation was a time that was sacred. It was a time that they were reminded that they were sacred and their womb, the whare tangata, the home of the people, is sacred, and that the woman should use this time for meditation at sacred sites. Te Awa Atua was a time when women were encouraged to take space and put themselves back into a space of their own. It was a time when you just got on with your own things, said one woman, just like when you were hapu, pregnant. People were always there in case you needed help. It sounds very different from the repressive, oppressive, we think you're dangerous and polluting Victorian approach to menstruation. And there's another book that I've read called Blood Magic that discusses anthropological and cultural ideas about menstruation from a number of different cultures. Too many to go into here. But one of them that resonated very strongly with me was that of the Yurok people up here in Northern California. Among the Yurok of Northern California, the menstrual taboos and exclusion were there to protect the creative spirituality of menstruating women from the influence of others who were in a more neutral state. The practices around menstruation were there to protect the others from the potent, positive spiritual forces of menstruating women. Moontime isolation was important because the seclusion allowed the Yurok women to take time away from their normal labours. They didn't have to work in the fields, they didn't have to make food. It gave them time away from men, time and an opportunity to achieve a spiritual ascendancy, time to meditate about their meaning in life. And also it seems that women who live very closely together like these women did were likely to menstruate at the same time, perhaps in sync with the moon. Believe it or not, that's called the McLintock effect, but it's got nothing to do with me. It's a woman called Martha McLintock. So imagine these Yurok women all menstruating at the same time, hanging out together in seclusion, away from men, not cooking, not cleaning, not doing anything. It doesn't sound too bad. And the Yurok women have wonderful stories in the olden days when they had a sacred moontime pond that they would go up there and perform rituals that would bring them spiritual benefits. They'd bring firewood back from that place to their menstrual shelters, their menstrual huts, and women created a connection between themselves and the planet. Some women only did these rites when they first had their periods, but aristocratic women were said to go to the pond every time they had a bleed until menopause. So far from being negative, menstruation seems to be a powerful time for women. There are some cultures that talk about it being a woman's capacity for worldly powers because she's got this ability to bleed, often profusely, without dropping dead. Some people think that women are an embodiment of a holy person during their period, and that women are powerful spiritually during their periods. They've got special intuitive powers, and some women might be called on to give advice or insight. But it really appears that this very positive narrative has been hijacked somewhat, and it's really not helped by the very dominant androcentric worldview and the world in which we live. So maybe it's a time for us women to reframe the narrative. Now, finally, I just want to talk about period poverty. It's increasingly recognised that in addition to the emotional and psychological cost of periods, there's a very real financial cost. In countries across the world, in many countries, 1 in 10 girls and women can't afford to buy sanitary protection. And you might use 20 to 25 tampons or pads for your average period. And in the UK, I know many women have to pay a tampon tax. In Australia and New Zealand, we pay a 15% tax on tampons and pads. I know that Tesco and other UK supermarket chains have got rid of this tampon tax and they pay it. Clearly buying tampons and pads is not a luxury. And actually with consumer pressure, it seems to me that the prices of these are dropping. And you know when something's really hit the meantime when it gets into British Vogue. But probably more sad than that is the fact that as many 1 in 10 girls across the world in developing countries drop out of school because they don't have proper access to menstrual products or access to washrooms, and they're embarrassed and worried about bleeding in front of their classmates. So you imagine if tampons are expensive for an average woman's periods, how much it costs to buy the tampons and the pads that you need. Just imagine with our community of women who've got heavy menstrual bleeding, how much more it costs. how many more days are lost from work or school. And just think about the impact then further in women who live in countries with far fewer resources. Now, we know that across the world there are great innovations being helped. To help this, there are new pads and things being made out of recycled products. This here is a moon cup, which is a reusable way to collect menstrual blood. There is now, on the 28th of May, coming up soon, a menstrual hygiene day that draws attention to these things. Now, we know that women with bleeding disorders have heavier and longer periods than other women. And we know that there is a predominant contemporary narrative for menstruation about it being a taboo subject, one that, if you talk about it, should be talked about in whispers. So this means that women within our community are inhibited from talking about them and seeking help. If we want to change this, we need to start by recognising the problem. It might take some time to change the narrative, but we do have to start. Gloria Steinman said if men could menstruate and women could not, it would become an enviable, worthy, masculine event. Education, I think, is a great way to start, and organisations like the World Federation of Hemophilia, with its global outreach, are perfectly placed across the world to help lead the change. We don't have to accept the status quo, and we shouldn't. In New Zealand and Australia, we've set up a group called the How Collaborative, which deals specifically with issues relating to women's health and bleeding or clotting. I think what we need to do, and this always makes me cry, these are my daughters, sorry. We need to teach our daughters and the girls and the women in our society and the men and boys in our societies that we should be proud of menstruation. It is sacred. It is tapu. It is our sacred river. Te awa atua. Thank you.